So it's official, Gen 3 Joola paddles are illegal for the time being, but that got me thinking, what are some of the best other paddles that provide that dynamic playability of really high power with pretty good control? Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets and Runners. First of all, I apologize that it's been so long since our last video. I had another one done, but that one's gonna have to wait till all this controversy gets resolved. But yeah, a tsunami hit the industry in the last couple of weeks. Gen 3 Joola paddles are now illegal, and while it looked like it was just an administrative issue for a bit there, turns out that wasn't the case. Obviously, we gave these a glowing review a few weeks back, and I really hope this situation gets resolved sooner rather than later because their playability is really off the charts. What the Gen 3 Joola paddles do better than pretty much any other paddle on the market right now is use foam to add a trampoline effect to the ball, which exponentially increases power the harder you hit. That high power is part of what got them banned, but the other thing that's special about these paddles is that trampoline effect implies a long dwell time, which has a really positive effect on their control. The ball spends plenty of time in the paddle face during contact, so even though it pops out with more power, you still have plenty of time to feel it and guide it during pocketing. This creates a unique combination of high power and high control, which is extremely attractive to advanced players because once you master that feel, they're pretty much elite in every performance metric. For now though, they're not around, and Vatic Pro has also decided to stop selling their Oni for the time being, which has a similar foam core and powerful feel. The good news is there are a number of other paddles on the market right now that may not feel identical to the Gen 3 Joolas, but also provide high levels of both power and control. In fact, it seems that in 2024, if you're not producing what I'm going to call these dynamic paddles, you're falling behind the industry curve. It makes sense. In 2021, we saw a huge increase in spin with carbon top sheets. In 2023, it was power and spin with thermoforming, and now it seems we've gone full circle trying to make control better while also pushing power and spin. So today we're going to talk about some of the best dynamic paddles on the market right now that could replace your Gen 3 Joolas. But before we get into any of that, let me remind you that any of the paddles we talk about on this channel you can check out on our website racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me and the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comments section what you want me to cover next. We're going to start with the Gearbox Pro Power Paddles because they're obviously the only legal paddles that we carry with foam-filled cores, so if you want the closest feel to a Gen 3 Joola, this is what you gotta go for. There are some differences, but honestly more similarities between their playability, to the point where I'm almost surprised that these are still legal if those Gen 3s got banned. Like the Joolas, they produce a trampoline effect that adds huge power to your ball, but, and this is the only reason why I think they're still around, it's a little bit less extreme. I mentioned in our Gen 3 review that I found the 16mm paddle to have even more top-end playability than the 14s, and that kind of applies to the Pro Powers as well. Because these are thinner, they have less foam, and that means there's less material to act on the ball. Basically, these paddles have less dwell time, so less top-end power, and also less feel and control. Also, one thing many players have noticed with foam-filled paddles is this notorious break-in period. Because foam is such a soft material, it breaks down quite quickly, and that obviously has an effect on playability. All foam paddles see a significant increase in power the more you play with them, but that increase is even more noticeable with thicker paddles, again, probably because there's more foam. That change in playability is less noticeable on both the 14mm Gen 3 Joolas and the Gearbox Pro Powers, which one, gives me hope that we'll see those 14s legalized soon, and two, makes me think that those Pro Powers are probably going to stay legal. So yeah, if you want the closest playability to your Gen 3 Joolas, you should go for the Gearbox Pro Power Paddles. They're obviously not the same, but nothing else is going to provide that dwell time, trampoline effect, and also the spin that comes with all of that. I want to make it clear that from here on out, all the paddles I'm talking about are going to feel very different to foam-filled paddles, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily worse. Kevlar paddles made a huge splash at the end of the year last year, but then seemed to kind of take a back seat when foam became more common, but these are still very dynamic, just maybe not as in your face. The power is extremely high, similar to carbon-faced thermoform paddles, but the Kevlar top sheet adds a layer of plushness and feel that you don't get with carbon. Kevlar is more flexible, especially when you make soft contact with the ball, but it provides equal power because it firms up the harder you hit. That plush to firm feel is what makes Kevlar paddles dynamic, but it's a much more subtle sensation than what foam feels like. There's no trampoline or spring effect here, and the dynamic feel is more control-based than power-based. Kevlar paddles are also fantastic for spin. Because they are a little bit softer, you can grab and shape the ball during dwell time, which is not something you get with traditional thermoform paddles. This is a spin profile that's similar to the Gen 3 Joolas, but it's worth noting that, again, it's not totally identical. Kevlar paddles work better in the soft spin game because they're easier paddles to control. There are also now a lot of options if you're looking for full Kevlar paddles. The 6-0 Ruby and Honolulu Pickleball J2K are fantastic if you're looking for something with a hybrid shape, and then the Hirachi X controls are great if you want something elongated. I'm not quite sure which I prefer. I need to spend a bit more time on court with the Hirachis, but the J2K and the Ruby are such incredible paddles because of the well-rounded playability and great maneuverability that hybrid shape offers. There's really not much equivalent to these in the Gen 3 lineup. Think of them kind of as a blend of the Scorpius and the Hyperion, but much closer to the Hyperion in playability. Rhombus has been quietly cooking up some technology that I absolutely love and hope will become more popular with more players trying it out. Their patent-pending carbon grid. It was first introduced to the edges of the Nova and now makes up the whole paddle face under the carbon top sheet on the Pulsar FX. And basically, it's a carbon grid weave that pockets the ball very differently to a standard carbon sheet. The carbon grid pattern is inherently more flexible, but it's still one seamless piece like other thermoform paddles, so it has a similar ability to firm up when you hit harder. These are actually very similar to Kevlar paddles, but I will say that dynamic sensation is a little bit more obvious here, especially on the control side of things. Whereas it's really just the top sheet that adds a bit of plushness to Kevlar paddles, here it's a significant core design element that makes them much more controlled than traditional thermoform paddles. I do think Kevlar paddles are a little bit more powerful because this grid pattern isn't quite as effective at transferring power as one raw sheet is, but it's a very marginal difference. These are some of my favorite paddles right now, and more specifically between the two, the Nova is a little bit more powerful and the Pulsar FX is a little bit more controlled. This makes sense. The Pulsar basically has more of this technology than the Nova, and like I said, it has more of a positive effect on control rather than power. These are also the easiest dynamic paddles to master. Obviously, when playability adapts to different types of shots, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to find that point where they go from soft to firm, but these have the most defined transition point. That's one of the main flaws with foam paddles, especially those 16mm Gen 3s. They're very difficult paddles to handle, so these are also a more user-friendly option if that's important to you. The Pro Powers, those rhombus paddles, Kevlar paddles, those are three paddles that provide the most balanced amount of power and control. Now we're going to move into talking about paddles that lean significantly more one way than the other, but are still worth noting. The Selkirk Lux Control Airs are some of the best paddles on the market right now that are significantly more controlled than they are powerful, but for having this much control and this thick a core, they are still pretty powerful. The closest playability you get here to the Gen 3 Joolas is that very long dwell time you have from this soft, thick core, but other than that, keep in mind they are very different. These are plush paddles that cushion the ball more like traditional paddles, and that makes control easier rather than harder the way the trampoline effect does. The thing is, like with all the other paddles on this list, these do firm up a little bit when you hit harder. It's certainly not extreme, but compared to soft paddles from 5 years ago, and even something like the Vanguard controls, these have significantly more pop, and that's because they're thermoform. Of course, that also has a positive effect on their spin. These are significantly more spin-friendly than non-thermoform soft paddles. I do wish they had a raw carbon top sheet instead of sprayed-on grip, but maybe that's something that'll come in the future. So while these may be primarily soft control paddles, they have such well-rounded playability compared to other paddles with this much control that I figured I'd include them on this list. But obviously, they're significantly less powerful than everything else here, so just keep that in mind if you decide to go for them. We're going to swing over to the opposite side of the playability pendulum now. If controlled airs are more controlled than they are powerful, then good old thermoform paddles are more powerful than they are controlled. I was actually really hesitating to put these paddles on this list, but I did want to talk about classic raw carbon thermoform paddles today, because obviously they've taken a backseat to some other stuff recently, but they're still very good paddles. Obviously, when they first came out, power and spin is what shocked everyone. Perhaps it's not as impressive as foam-filled paddles, but these are legal. What I did want to focus on was their control, though, because yes, these are very firm paddles. They don't really have that dynamic playability, but they're still good in the soft game for a couple of reasons. The thermoformed unibody construction makes these paddles very stable and very consistent. Okay, they may not be soft, but those other characteristics are crucial in the touch game. I actually find them better for control than a lot of non-thermoform paddles because those can feel a little bit random at times, and thermoforming eliminates that randomness almost altogether. You know exactly how the ball is going to shoot off the paddle face, so even though they might be a little more poppy, they'll never surprise you, so once you're dialed, you're pretty much good to go. So the moral of the story is basically don't forget about good old-fashioned thermoform paddles. They may not be as hyped anymore, but they're certainly not bad. In fact, I think this is still probably the most popular form of paddle amongst the pros. There's also a huge amount of variety. I'm not going to name them all, but you've got a ton of standard paddles, hybrid paddles, and elongated paddles, so take your pick. I also quickly wanted to touch on the Shogun, which I'm currently in the process of reviewing. From what I can tell so far, with its titanium and carbon top sheet, it's similar to Kevlar paddles with that dynamic feel. I don't want to get too specific because I'm still figuring it out, but compared directly to the Filth, it definitely has a bit more control and also some more top-end pop, so stay tuned for that review. That's going to wrap up this list though. As you can see, there are a ton of options if you're stranded without your Gen 3 Joolas, so don't worry, and hopefully this situation gets resolved soon. I'm also really curious to hear about what you all think about the foam issue, how Kevlar compares to it, and also what technological developments you think are going to come next. For now though, that is going to be the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, if you want to demo any of these paddles, you can come visit us in store, or you can check them out online at racketsandrunners.ca.